The last stand of the aliens. The galaxy was on the brink of despair. The war, once a symbol of hope for the oppressed, was now a losing battle for humanity. Alien forces, with their advanced technology and overwhelming numbers, had pushed human resistance to the edge of extinction. What little remained of the human fleet was scattered across distant planets, fighting for their lives, knowing the end was near. The aliens, led by the merciless Xanthari Empire, were preparing for the final strike. On the edge of a forgotten world, far from the main battlefronts, a small but determined group of human soldiers held their ground. Their makeshift base was built on a moon, barely more than a few reinforced structures surrounded by the harsh, empty landscape. There were no cities here, no bustling population, just a handful of soldiers, survivors of countless battles, willing to fight to the very end. Captain Sarah Hartley stood before a large window, looking out at the empty sky. She had been part of the resistance for years, fighting against impossible odds. Now the final push was coming, and she knew it would be the end of the road for humanity if they failed. She turned away from the window, her eyes meeting those of her fellow soldiers. "They think we've been beaten," she said, her voice low and steady. "They think we've given up." Her second-in-command, Lieutenant Ben Mitchell, nodded grimly. "They're wrong. The fight isn't over yet." Sarah paced across the room, her boots clicking softly against the metal floor. "But what if it is? What if we don't have anything left to fight with? The Xanthari have crushed everything we've built. Our fleet is destroyed, and Earth is gone." The room was silent. The mention of Earth always brought a heavy weight into the air. Earth had been the heart of humanity, the birthplace of civilization. But now it was just a memory. The Xanthari had wiped it out, along with any hope for a peaceful future. "We still have something," said Sergeant David Lee, his voice sharp. "We have each other, and that's more than they think we do." Sarah looked at him, her gaze softening. "You're right, but it's not enough. We need a miracle." As she spoke, the communications officer, Private Hannah Cruz, interrupted. "Captain, you need to see this." The entire room fell silent as Sarah walked over to the console. Hannah's fingers hovered over the controls, eyes wide with shock. She pressed a button, and a strange, static-filled signal appeared on the screen. It wasn't the usual noise of the enemy's broadcasts. It was something different, something human. "Is that?" Sarah began, squinting at the screen. "It's a distress signal," Hannah said. "A human distress signal. But it's been silent for years. No one has heard from the outer colonies in ages." "Where's it coming from?" Ben asked, stepping closer to the screen. "Coordinates match an old human outpost," Hannah replied, pointing to a map on the screen. "It's deep in enemy territory. The Xanthari have completely surrounded it." A wave of disbelief washed over the room. "This can't be right," Sarah muttered. "There's no way any human survivors would be left out there. The Xanthari took everything." "We have to check it," David said, his voice urgent. "It could be our last chance. If anyone is out there, they might have something we can use, something we can fight with." Sarah felt a chill run through her. The thought of venturing into the heart of enemy-controlled space was terrifying. But if there was even a sliver of hope, they had to take it. For humanity's sake, they couldn't let this chance slip by. "We'll need a plan," Sarah said, her mind racing. "If we go in, it won't be easy. The Xanthari have the entire sector locked down. But we don't have a choice." As she spoke, the tension in the room thickened. The soldiers knew that this mission would be their most dangerous yet. If the Xanthari discovered them, it would be the end. But Sarah saw something in their eyes, something she hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. A flicker of it, deep down, buried under the weight of all their losses. "We can't fail," Sarah continued, her voice firm. "This is humanity's last chance. We'll find out who sent that signal, and we'll do whatever it takes to get to them." Just as she finished speaking, the ship's alarms blared, cutting through the heavy silence. The alert system flickered to life, showing the shadowy forms of Xanthari ships closing in on their location. "They've found us," Hannah cried. "Get to your stations, now," Sarah ordered, her voice sharp and commanding. "We're not running. We're not hiding. We fight. Prepare for an ambush. If they want a war, they'll get one." The soldiers scrambled to their positions, knowing the enemy was closing in. The weight of their situation hung over them like a storm cloud, but Sarah refused to let them falter. She had seen the end of everything too many times to count, but she wasn't ready to accept it yet, not when there was still a chance. As the Xanthari ships descended upon them, Sarah looked one last time at the coordinates of the distress signal on the map. It was a long shot, a desperate mission, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of something more than fear. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was defiance. Whatever it was, she would cling to it. The war was almost over. But not yet. Not while humans still fought. The unlikely alliance. The sound of blaring alarms filled the air as Sarah Hartley and her crew scrambled to prepare for what seemed like a hopeless defense. The Xanthari Empire's ships loomed ominously in the dark expanse of space, closing in fast. There was no place to hide, no escape. This was the moment they'd been dreading for years. The final confrontation. The Xanthari were ruthless and relentless, and there was no guarantee they would survive. "Captain, the Xanthari ships are entering firing range." Hannah Kruz, the communications officer, shouted over the chaos, her face pale. "Hold steady," Sarah barked. "Get the weapons online. We're not giving up without a fight." The crew moved with precision, their years of training taking over. Sarah knew they couldn't afford to waste time. If they stood any chance of surviving this, they needed to outsmart the Xanthari, something they had done countless times before. "Lieutenant Mitchell, power up the shield generators," Sarah commanded as she walked toward the tactical map of the space surrounding their small base. "We need to buy ourselves some time. If we can hold them off long enough, we can launch a counterattack." Mitchell nodded, his face determined. "Aye, Captain." Shielding at 40%, increasing power. But even as the shields powered up, Sarah knew the odds were against them. The Xanthari had the advantage in firepower and technology. Their ships were bigger, stronger, and faster. It wouldn't take much for the enemy to overwhelm their defenses. As the countdown to the enemy's strike continued, Sarah's thoughts shifted to the mysterious distress signal. It had been transmitted from deep inside Xanthari-controlled territory, an area they had no business approaching. But something about the signal felt important. Something about it felt like it could change everything. "Captain," Hannah's voice broke Sarah's thoughts. "The signal, it's coming from within enemy lines. If we follow the coordinates, we might be able to find the source. We can't just ignore it." Sarah turned to face the communications officer, her heart racing. "Do you think it's a trap?" Hannah hesitated for a moment. "It's possible. But it's also our only shot. If we don't act, we're dead. The Xanthari are closing in. If there are any survivors left, they might have something that can turn the tide of the war." The thought was terrifying. To venture deeper into enemy-controlled space was to walk into the heart of a beast's lair. But Sarah knew they couldn't give up. They had to take the risk. There was no other choice. "All right," she said, her voice resolute. "We go for it. We've survived worse. Now let's see if we can get to the source of that signal. The Xanthari won't know what hit them." The crew moved quickly, setting course toward the unknown coordinates. They knew that this was their only chance to turn the tide of the war, but it would take everything they had to survive. As they approached the unknown location, the atmosphere aboard the ship grew tense. The soldiers were ready for anything, but the uncertainty of what lay ahead hung over them like a thick fog. "I've never been this deep into Xanthari territory before," Lieutenant Ben Mitchell said, his voice low. "If we're not careful, we'll be walking right into a trap." Sarah nodded, her eyes locked on the tactical display. "Stay focused. If we can get in and out quickly, we might stand a chance. The silence was deafening as they entered the heart of enemy space. The stars around them seemed to vanish as they slipped into the blackness. The ship's sensors barely registered the surrounding vessels. Xanthari ships hidden in the shadows, waiting for any sign of weakness. Then, without warning, the sensors flickered to life. Something was moving out there, something larger than any ship they had seen before. "Captain," Hannah shouted, "there's something massive ahead. An unknown ship. It's enormous." The crew exchanged nervous glances. "Do we engage?" Ben asked, his voice tight with tension. Sarah's mind raced. The sight of an alien warship, one that had never been encountered before, raised every red flag she had. This was not just another Xanthari fleet. This was something new, something dangerous. "We don't have the luxury of choice," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "We have to push forward." As the massive unknown ship loomed closer, the crew braced themselves. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was overwhelming. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. If they weren't careful, they could end up as nothing more than another casualty in the galaxy's long history of warfare. But as they drew closer to the coordinates, something unexpected happened. The massive ship stopped. It didn't move. It just hovered, waiting. "What in the world?" Ben muttered. Maybe it's not hostile," Hannah suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. "We've never encountered anything like this before." Sarah's instincts screamed at her to be cautious. "Stay sharp, everyone. We don't know what we're dealing with yet. Prepare for anything." The crew had no idea what awaited them beyond the ship. Was this a trap, or was this the help they'd been waiting for? It was clear that whatever came next would shape the future of the war. The stakes had never been higher. Then the ship's docking bay opened, and a signal began broadcasting. It wasn't an enemy transmission. It was a human voice. "Please, if anyone is out there, come to us. We have what you need to win." The voice was clear, but it was shaky, desperate. The crew could hardly believe their ears. They had found it, the last hope for humanity. But who were these people, and what had they discovered? Sarah's pulse quickened. She knew this was it, the moment she had been waiting for. The fate of the galaxy rested on the decisions they would make now. And the aliens would be watching, waiting for their next move. "Prepare to board," Sarah said, a determined look on her face. "We're about to find out if this is the answer to the war." The mysterious visitors. The ship's interior was unlike anything Sarah Hartley had ever seen. The moment they entered the docking bay, the air felt different, cooler, almost sterile, as though it had been untouched for years. The faint hum of technology filled the space, but there was no sign of the alien influence that had taken over so many other ships and stations. This was something human. It was home. "Stay alert," Sarah ordered as the crew disembarked from their own ship, weapons at the ready. They had no idea what to expect on the other side of the airlock. But this place didn't feel like the cold, hostile environment of the Xanthari. It was familiar, even if it was abandoned. "Looks like no one's been here for a while," Lieutenant Ben Mitchell said, his voice echoing as they stepped further into the ship. The walls were lined with strange symbols and markings, yet the design was distinctly human. There was no telling how long it had been since anyone had set foot here, but the structure itself seemed remarkably well preserved. "It's like a ghost ship," said Sergeant David Lee, glancing around uneasily. "But there's a presence here. I can feel it." Sarah nodded. "Let's keep moving. We need to find the source of that signal." They ventured deeper into the vessel, their footsteps muffled by the thick metallic floors. The corridors were narrow, and there was a faint smell of machinery and old equipment in the air. But despite the eerie silence, the team pushed forward, navigating through the twisting hallways with careful precision. Suddenly, the quiet was broken by the crackle of static. Sarah's hand instinctively went to the comm unit on her belt. "Captain," Hannah Kruz's voice came through, her tone urgent. I'm picking up something. It's faint, but it's coming from the next chamber. I think it's them. The ones who sent the signal. The team exchanged looks of confusion. Who are they? Ben asked. And why would they send us here? What are they hiding? Sarah didn't have the answers. We'll find out soon enough, she said, motioning for them to proceed. As they reached the door to the next chamber, Sarah's pulse quickened. Something about this place felt wrong, like they were walking into a trap. But they had come too far to turn back now. The fate of humanity depended on what they could find here. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a large, dimly lit room. In the center of the room, there was a table, covered in strange, glowing devices and artifacts. But it wasn't the technology that caught Sarah's attention. It was the people. There were 3 humans in the room, standing in the shadows, watching them with intense eyes. They wore dark, tattered uniforms that seemed out of place with the pristine surroundings. Their faces were worn, hardened, as if they had been through unimaginable horrors. "Who are you?" Sarah demanded, her voice steady but her heart racing. She had expected to find answers, but not like this. These were survivors, yes, but who were they? And why were they hiding? One of the figures stepped forward, his face stern. "We've been waiting for you," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "And you're not the first ones to come looking, but we are the last." The others didn't speak. They just stood there, observing Sarah and her crew with a mixture of caution and curiosity. "The last," Sarah repeated, trying to make sense of his words. "What do you mean? Are there more of you out there?" The man shook his head. "We are the last humans. The last survivors of the outer colonies. The last hope." He paused, his gaze hardening. "And we've been watching the Xanthari wipe out everything you've ever known. Earth, the fleet, it's all gone. But we have something they want, and it's the only thing that could end this war." Sarah's mind was spinning. "What do you have? What could you possibly have that the Xanthari don't already control?" The man motioned to the table, where the strange glowing devices lay. "These are not just any weapons. They're the key to defeating the Xanthari. We've spent years studying their technology, learning how to counter it. And now we can use their own power against them. But we need help. We need more soldiers. We need the kind of fury that only humanity can bring." It was a chilling revelation. For years, humanity had fought the Xanthari with everything they had, but they had never had the upper hand. Now it seemed, this small group of survivors had uncovered a weapon capable of changing the course of the war. "You're telling me you have the power to defeat the Xanthari?" Ben asked, disbelief in his voice. "How? Where did you find this?" The man's face darkened. "We didn't find it. We built it. And now, it's time for humanity to rise. But we can't do it alone. You came here for a reason. If you want to survive this, you'll fight with us." Sarah's mind raced. Could this really be it? Could this small band of survivors hold the key to humanity's salvation? Before she could respond, a loud bang echoed through the ship. The walls trembled and the lights flickered. "We don't have time to explain," the man said urgently. "The Xanthari have found us." "Then we'll fight," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the growing chaos around them. She turned to her crew, who were already preparing for battle. As they made their way to the ship's control room, the sound of alien footsteps grew louder. The Xanthari were here. But Sarah felt something inside her stir. For the first time in a long while, she felt something other than fear. She felt hope. The first clash. The ship shook violently as the first of the Xanthari assault ships impacted against the outer hull. Sarah Hartley gritted her teeth, her heart pounding in her chest. The last few hours had been a blur, preparing the survivors, gathering the strange weapons, and now fighting for their lives. It felt like a dream, but it was all too real. The Xanthari were at their doorstep. "Captain, we're losing structural integrity on the aft section," Lieutenant Ben Mitchell shouted over the growing sounds of chaos. We need to retreat or risk losing the whole ship. Sarah looked toward the survivors who had joined them, their faces grim and resolute. The mysterious man, who had led them into this unknown warship, stood by her side, his eyes fixed on the control room screens. "We can't leave," Sarah said firmly. "Not yet. We need to launch those weapons, or humanity's finished." The man nodded. "The weapons are primed, but they need to be activated in the main control room. If we don't reach it before they breach the ship, it'll all be for nothing." The urgency of the situation hit Sarah like a slap to the face. Every second counted. The Xanthari weren't just attacking. They were coming to wipe them off the map. The fate of humanity rested on a single push of a button. There was no turning back. "Ben, get the weapons system online," Sarah ordered, her voice cold with determination. "We're moving out." Her crew moved quickly, gathering their weapons and readying themselves for the fight ahead. The humans had been through countless battles, but this felt different. The stakes were higher. The Xanthari were relentless, but Sarah had something they didn't. She had humanity's fury, and that was something the aliens couldn't anticipate. As they made their way through the corridors, the ship groaned under the pressure of the enemy's assault. Alien gunfire echoed through the hallways, the sound of a war they had no chance of winning, unless they acted now. Suddenly, the control room door slid open, revealing a scene of destruction. Xanthari warriors flooded the room, their insect-like bodies swarming in all directions, their weapons aimed at the small group of humans entering. "Take cover," Sarah shouted, pulling out her blaster and opening fire. Her team followed suit, their weapons sending bursts of energy into the oncoming alien forces. The survivors fought with them, though their weapons were strange and unfamiliar. But there was something about their precision, their ability to anticipate the aliens' movements, that gave Sarah hope. They weren't just any survivors. They were fighters, and they weren't going down without a fight. Sarah took a deep breath and dove behind a nearby pillar, narrowly avoiding a burst of enemy fire. She could feel the heat of the Xanthari shots on her skin, and the air tasted bitter with smoke and electricity. "Ben, where's that weapon activation?" Sarah called out, her voice urgent. "Almost there, Captain," Ben replied, his eyes wide with concentration. He was hunched over the control panel, his fingers moving rapidly over the keys. The battle was fierce, and it seemed like there were more aliens with every passing second. The ship's halls echoed with the sounds of gunfire and the cries of the wounded. Sarah's mind was racing. How much time did they have? Could they hold the line long enough to activate the weapon? Then suddenly, the sound of the alien assault ceased. It wasn't a retreat, though. It was something worse. The lights flickered, and a booming voice filled the air. "This is the Xanthari Empire. You are wasting your time. We already control the galaxy. You cannot defeat us." The voice sent chills down Sarah's spine. It was the voice of the enemy leader, cold, calculating, and sure of their victory. But Sarah wasn't going to back down. "Get to that activation button now," she yelled, her voice sharp and full of fire. Ben slammed his fist down on the panel. The room hummed to life, and a surge of energy flooded through the walls. Sarah could feel the change, the power building, the weapon coming online. But the Xanthari were already inside the room. More warriors poured in, their alien faces twisted into menacing sneers. Sarah didn't hesitate. She drew her weapon, aimed it at the leader of the alien forces, and fired. The shot hit its mark, right in the chest. The alien leader staggered back in shock, and for the first time in Sarah's life, she saw fear in the Xanthari's eyes. But there was no time to savor the victory. The weapon was activated, and the hum of energy in the room intensified. Sarah could feel the power surging through the walls, building with unstoppable force. "It's ready," Ben called out, turning to Sarah. "We've got one shot at this. Activate the release, and the Xanthari will be crippled." Sarah's heart raced as she sprinted to the central console, her fingers flying over the buttons. She didn't know what the weapon would do, but she knew one thing: It was their last hope. With a final decisive press, the ship shook violently as the weapon unleashed its full power. A blinding light erupted from the control room, consuming everything in its path. The force was so powerful, so overwhelming, that it felt like the very fabric of space itself was being torn apart. The Xanthari screamed in shock, their ship shaking from the force of the weapon. Then, silence. For a moment, it was as if the universe had frozen. The hum of the ship ceased. The blaring alarms stopped, and for the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself a moment to breathe. "Did it work?" Ben asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah glanced around, her breath caught in her throat. The alien warriors lay scattered across the room, their bodies inert, their once menacing presence gone. But that wasn't all. The Xanthari ships, which had been so close to destroying them, now floated in the void, their engines sputtering, lifeless. The weapon had worked. The aftermath. The silence that followed the weapon's activation was both deafening and peaceful. For a brief moment, Sarah Hartley and her crew stood in stunned disbelief. The Xanthari forces, once so sure of their victory, were now incapacitated. The control room was littered with the remains of the alien invaders, their once imposing figures now lying motionless on the cold floor. But Sarah knew better than to get comfortable. The battle wasn't over yet. There was still the larger war to fight, and they couldn't afford to rest for too long. "Ben, are the engines still operational?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the chaos that had just unfolded. Ben wiped the sweat from his forehead, still in disbelief, but quickly moved to his station. "I'm running diagnostics now, Captain. We got some damage to repair, but we should be able to move. The Xanthari ships are disabled for now, but they won't stay down forever. We've bought ourselves some time, but it won't last." Sarah nodded. Time. It was always a race against it. "Get us ready to leave," she ordered. "We're not sticking around here." The crew moved swiftly, each member taking their positions, as the survivors assisted in patching up the ship. The strange weapons they had found were invaluable, but it was the humans' unbreakable spirit that had made the difference. Sarah looked toward the survivors. They were no longer just a ragtag group of fugitives. They were warriors, and they had just played a pivotal role in the fight against the Xanthari. "Captain," the survivor leader spoke up, his voice low and serious. "What's the next move?" Sarah looked at him, her mind racing with possibilities. The war was far from over. The Xanthari Empire was vast, and this was just one victory in a long and deadly war. But she had something now, a weapon that could tip the scales in humanity's favor. "We find more of those weapons," she said firmly. "We gather more people, and we fight back. The Xanthari have underestimated us for too long. Now they'll know that humanity is not to be trifled with." The survivor nodded. "I agree, but we need a base of operations. We can't fight without a plan." Sarah turned to Ben. "What's our status? Can we get to Earth?" Ben glanced at his screen, a grim expression crossing his face. "Earth's been hit hard, Captain. The Xanthari took down most of our communications and military bases months ago, but there's still a resistance. There's a chance we could make it to a safe zone, but we need to move fast." The survivor leader spoke again, this time more urgently. "We've encountered Xanthari patrols on the outer rim. If they detect us leaving this sector, we'll be hunted." Sarah's mind raced. The Xanthari were relentless, and there was no telling what kind of retaliation they would unleash once they regrouped. But they had no choice. They couldn't stay here, waiting for the enemy to come back with reinforcements. "Then we move quickly," Sarah said, decisiveness in her voice. "We'll head for the outer rim. There's a resistance station there. It's our best shot." With that, Sarah made her decision. They were leaving this ship, the last remnant of a battle that had shifted the course of the war. They had gained a precious victory, but it was only the beginning. The hidden resistance. The ship shuddered as it slowly moved into the depths of space, the remains of the battle still hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Sarah's crew worked tirelessly to patch up their ship, making sure everything was operational despite the chaos that had unfolded. They were all exhausted, but they couldn't afford rest yet. The resistance station they were heading to wasn't far, but the journey could be treacherous. The Xanthari were known for their relentless pursuit. "Captain, we're approaching the coordinates," Ben said, his voice laced with both tension and determination. "The resistance base is just ahead. If the intel is correct, we should find enough supplies to continue our fight." Sarah stared at the screen. The bright light of distant stars illuminated the cold void of space, but beneath that, her thoughts were focused on the future. They had survived the first wave of the Xanthari, but the real fight was still ahead. She could almost feel the looming shadow of the enemy's wrath. "Get us in closer," she ordered. "We can't afford to be detected. The Xanthari will be looking for us." The ship's engines hummed quietly as they glided through space, moving at the bare minimum speed to avoid detection. The faint glow of the resistance station appeared on their radar, and it didn't take long before they could see the small, hidden base taking shape in the distance, a seemingly unremarkable station nestled among the asteroid fields. To anyone else, it would look like nothing more than debris or a forgotten outpost. But to those in the know, it was a lifeline. "Entering range," Ben reported. "We're on approach." As they drew closer, Sarah could see the faint glimmer of activity on the station. It was smaller than she expected, almost like a secret hideout. But she couldn't afford to be picky. It had to be enough. "Captain, there's a Xanthari patrol nearby," one of the survivors warned. "They might have detected us." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. They didn't have much time before the patrol noticed their presence. She turned to Ben, who was already scanning the area. "Can you take us in unnoticed?" Sarah asked urgently. Ben's eyes were locked on the controls, his fingers flying across the buttons. "I'll try, but it's risky. The patrols are good at detecting ships. We'll need to stay hidden long enough to dock." The ship's engines hummed again as they began to drift closer to the station, blending with the surrounding asteroids. Sarah's pulse raced as the distance between them and the patrol narrowed. The tension was thick in the air, and she could feel every second passing like an eternity. "Hold your positions," Sarah ordered. "No one makes a sound." The ship glided silently through the field, its systems shutting down all unnecessary power to minimize detection. Every person on board held their breath, their eyes glued to the dark space around them, watching for any sign of the Xanthari. For a brief moment, all Sarah could hear was the beat of her own heart. Then finally, the voice of Ben broke the silence. "We're in," he said, his voice a sigh of relief. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. They had made it to the resistance base without detection. "Good work, Ben," she said, her voice calm but laced with appreciation. "Now let's get to work. We don't know how much time we have." The docking bay of the station was small, barely enough to accommodate their ship. The crew began unloading, the survivors moving with practiced precision, their faces grim but hopeful. They were no longer just fleeing. They were preparing for the next stage of the war. The resistance base, though small, was alive with activity. As Sarah and her crew made their way through the station, she could see the scars of previous battles. There were few soldiers, but the ones she saw had the same look in their eyes that she had seen in the mirror: determination. "We'll need more than supplies here," Sarah said to the leader of the resistance. "We need a plan. The Xanthari will be coming for us. They won't stop." The resistance leader, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, nodded grimly. "We've been holding out here for months, but we don't have much left. If we want to make a stand, we need to gather allies. We can't win this alone." Sarah's eyes hardened with resolve. "Then we'll find those allies. The Xanthari have underestimated humanity for far too long. It's time to show them we're not afraid to fight back." The resistance leader gave her a small, weary smile. "I believe you, Captain. You're not like the others. You're the spark we need." Sarah nodded, her mind already racing with plans. She knew this was only the beginning. The Xanthari might have thought they had crushed humanity, but Sarah had one thing the aliens could never understand: the power of human spirit. The humans may have been underestimated, but it was time to change that. The final push. The resistance base was alive with urgency. Sarah, having just arrived, was already in motion. She had no time to waste. The Xanthari were a relentless enemy, and their small victory over the alien invaders in the first battle was already beginning to feel like a distant memory. Now, with the hope of Earth's survival hanging by a thread, they had to prepare for what was coming next: a final assault. The crew was busy preparing supplies, making repairs, and organizing whatever they could find to aid in their mission. The resistance fighters, though fewer in number than Sarah had hoped, were determined and fierce. They had endured constant attacks, but they had not given up. Sarah admired their resolve, but she knew that it wouldn't be enough on its own. She stood before a large map of the solar system, which hung on the wall of the station's command center. Ben, who had become an indispensable ally throughout their journey, was by her side, studying the map intently. "The Xanthari forces are vast," Ben said quietly, his eyes tracing the map. "If we're going to take them on, we need to strike quickly. They'll regroup soon. We have to hit their weakest point." Sarah crossed her arms, her eyes scanning the map. The Xanthari had left destruction in their wake, and their control over Earth's orbit had made it nearly impossible to launch any kind of counteroffensive. But there was something in the asteroid field, a hidden outpost, one that had yet to be discovered by the enemy. If they could seize it, they might just have the upper hand. "This outpost," Sarah said, pointing at a small marker on the map, "it's our best shot. We can use it as a base to launch a final assault on the Xanthari fleet. But we'll need every hand we can get." The resistance leader, still by her side, gave a solemn nod. "We don't have the numbers, but we have the will to fight. We've got your back, Captain." Sarah's resolve hardened. This was it. There would be no second chances. "We need to gather more support," she said. "If we want to have a chance against the Xanthari, we need to find more human fighters, more resistance groups, more soldiers. The time for hesitation is over. We go now." The crew moved quickly, the urgency of their mission evident in the way they worked. Sarah knew that once they left the safety of this hidden base, there would be no turning back. The Xanthari had likely detected their presence already. They would be hunting them down as they moved, and every moment was precious. "Ben," Sarah said, her eyes still fixed on the map, "can we get a message to the other resistance cells in the outer colonies? We need reinforcements." Ben hesitated. "We can try, but communication lines have been cut. It's risky. The Xanthari have jammed most of our transmissions." "We don't have a choice," Sarah replied firmly. "If we don't act now, Earth is gone." The crew worked together, pooling their resources to send a transmission. The hours passed, and the tension continued to build. Sarah paced, her thoughts never straying far from the looming threat of the Xanthari. She knew they were closing in, but she had no intention of letting them take Earth without a fight. Humanity had suffered long enough. It was time to show the galaxy that Earth wasn't some weakling waiting to be conquered. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the transmission was sent. "It's done," Ben said, his voice filled with both hope and uncertainty. "Now we wait." The waiting was agonizing. Every second felt like an eternity, and Sarah's mind raced. Would reinforcements arrive in time? Would they have enough to fight back the Xanthari? But then, just as she feared they would be forced into action without support, a signal came through. It was faint, but it was unmistakable. The resistance cells had received their message. "They're on their way," Ben said, a smile of relief breaking through his tense demeanor. "We've got backup." "Good," Sarah said, her heart quickening. "Now we move." With that, Sarah and her team set course for the outpost. They had one chance to make this count. The ship left the station with precision, their engines roaring to life. Sarah's crew was ready for whatever lay ahead. The space between them and the Xanthari was vast, but the will of humanity was even vaster. The final battle was at hand, and Sarah would lead them into it with everything they had. The Xanthari had underestimated them once, but they would not make that mistake again. The last stand of humanity was coming, and this time, it would be the Xanthari who felt the heat of humanity's fury.